Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to the Pioneer Institute for organizing this discussion of World War II. I would like to begin on a personal note that will strike you at first as completely unrelated to our subject today, but I'm going to try to demonstrate that it does have some relationship to it. I do a lot of bicycle riding back in California where I live, and a few years ago on a foggy Saturday morning I found myself in the parking lot of a motel in Carmel, California, getting ready to ride roughly 100 miles down the Big Sur coast. Some of you may know the Big Sur coastline of California, a very beautiful place. I knew virtually nobody in the group of 100 and so people, so we were all kind of milling around, and you have to imagine this scene in your mind's eye, a bunch of middle-aged people in spandex getting ready to go down the road. And one of these gentlemen, a fellow writer, came up and introduced himself to me, and he said, "My name's Jack McLachlan. I'm a lawyer in San Francisco. How about you?" I said, "Well, Jack, happy to meet you. My name's David Kennedy. I teach history at Stanford University." He said, "Oh, you historians, I know all about you guys." He said, "All you do is you make up these what-if scenarios. What if this had happened? How would things be different? What if this had not happened? How would the course of events run differently?" Well, as you might imagine, I thought that was a pretty severely reductionist description of my life's work. But before I could muster anything even remotely resembling a cogent answer, he said, "Well, I've got one for you," and you could hear the inner voice, Mr. Smarty Pants Professor. He said, "What if on November 22nd, 1963, it had been not John F. Kennedy, but Nikita Khrushchev who had fallen to the assassin's bullet? How would the course of subsequent history have been different?" As you might imagine, I had never thought about that question before. And as I was trying to gin up something that would resemble a reasonable answer, he said, "Well, I'll tell you." Again, you should have seen it coming. He said, "I'll tell you one thing we can say with absolute certainty about the subsequent course of history. If it had been Khrushchev and not Kennedy who had died on that day, Aristotle Onassis would not have married Mrs. Khrushchev." Now, it's very gratifying to me to see that many people in this room get the joke. There's some people sitting down here who are staring at me blankly, I think. And this, among other things, illustrates that humor is generational in character. If you don't have a mental picture of Mrs. Khrushchev in your head and Mrs. Kennedy and so on, you really don't get it. Okay. All right. Well, the serious point of this is that I think Jack McLachlan, the guy that pulled this thing on me, the original version of this story actually goes back, I've later learned, to a conversation between Gough Whitlam, the Australian premier, and Mao Zedong, but that's another matter. But anyway, Jack McLachlan really did pull this thing on me, and I think if you reflect on it for a moment, he actually had a serious point. That history is not a bench science, a laboratory science. We can't titrate historical events, add or subtract this element, see how the reaction goes forward or not. So we do, whether explicitly or implicitly, often indulge in these thinking exercises about what if something had gone differently, how might the whole course of events have taken shape differently. So here's a serious version, I think, of that question that Jack McLachlan pulled on me. What if the United States had lost World War II? How would the course of subsequent history have been different? Now, that's a very strong form of the question. Maybe a somewhat more historically responsible form of the question is, what if the United States had emerged victorious in the war, but had gone to war on a different timetable, on different strategic principles, and with a different force composition? How would the outcome have differently shaped the world that we've all lived in ever since? And I do think the shadow of World War II casts itself right down into our present century. So that's the proposition I want to explore with you here this morning by way of illuminating what I'm going to call America's grand strategy in that war. So there's a premise that underlies these remarks. The premise is that the World War II was a dramatically transformative event in the history of this society and indeed of the world. That's the premise. The proposition that I want to urge upon you here this morning is that the transformations that war worked did not just happen, particularly in the case of the United States. They were the result of some very deliberately taken strategic decisions about how to fight a particular war in a particular way with a particular composition of forces and a particular timetable. And thirdly, The events of that war, the results of that grand strategy, created the platform or the scaffolding or the infrastructure, if you want, on which all subsequent history has quite measurably built. Okay, so how transformative was World War II? When I think about this, I go back to a sentence that I read in a speech of Winston Churchill's, given in mid-August 1945. On the occasion of he was reflecting on the announcement, which was only 24 hours old or less, that the Japanese now intended to surrender. The war in Europe had ended in May of 1945. Japanese now in August of 1945 were about to surrender as well. And Churchill took to the floor of Parliament and gave one of his more succinct speeches. And there was one sentence in it that when I read it, it just jumped off the page at me for a number of reasons. Not least of all, he rendered the United States in a fashion that has long since gone out of use in American English, but apparently was still common in British English. He rendered the United States as a plural noun. And the sentence that grabbed me, he said, "The United States stand at this moment at the summit of the world." It's mid-August 1945. The United States stand at this moment at the summit of the world. Now that, I think, was a very true and accurate statement at that moment, and with proper qualifications, it has remained true in substantial degree ever since. But from an historian's point of view, what is so arresting about that sentence, aside from the peculiar grammar, is the fact that from the vantage point of just 5 years earlier, in 1940, that statement, the United States stand at the summit of the world, was just wildly improbable. So something happened between 1940 and 1945 to make that statement that would have been improbable in 1940 accurate in 1945, and of course what happened is World War II, and that's our subject. So let's just cast our minds back briefly to 1940. 1940 is the 11th year, customarily defined, of the Great Depression. We believe that as late as 1940, 45% of all white households and 95% of all African American households, applying the metrics of poverty that were developed a generation later, 45% of white households, 95% of black households lived below the poverty line as of 1940. One Hoover administration and two Roosevelt administrations had, as of 1940, failed to find the exit from the greatest economic crisis in modern history. Just 5 years over the horizon of the future, this country was about to launch itself onto a sustained, generation-long period of economic growth that gave us the affluent society that we've had ever since. And if we turn to the international arena and ask what are the contrasts between 1940 and 1945, the differences are, if anything, even more dramatic than they are in the domestic sphere. Because internationally, as of 1940, the United States was a country that had refused to join the new international body, the League of Nations, even though it was the brainchild of an American president in 1918, at the conclusion of World War I. It was a country that for the first time had imposed a numerical cap on legal immigration to the United States in 1924, a country that insisted on the repayment of U.S. Treasury loans to the Allied governments after World War I, an insistence that badly disrupted international capital flows in the interwar period, and some would argue contributed, not trivially, to the crisis that we know as the Great Depression. It was a country that had passed the highest protective tariff in its history in 1930, the notorious Smoot-Hawley tariff, a country that had passed no fewer than 5 neutrality statutes in the 1930s, guaranteed supposedly to keep the United States out of any future conflict. In short, on every metric, this country was experiencing the most deeply isolationist moment in its long history in the years before 1940. So if you'd walk down the streets of any major American city, Boston, let's say, in 1940, and you'd heard a street corner speaker saying something like, "My fellow citizens, I'm here in this year of grace 1940 to tell you that this economically stricken country of ours and this deeply isolationist country of ours, just 5 years from now, 1945, will stand on the threshold of a period of economic growth and widely shared prosperity such as we've never seen before. And what's more, our isolationist country will not only, it won't simply join the League of Nations, it will form a new international organization called the United Nations. It will domicile it in our principal city of New York. We will take the lead in creating new international institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and so on and so forth. And we will lead the globe into a period of global economic growth such as has never been seen before. So much so that by the end of this century, my fellow citizens, a new word will be coined, going to common currency to describe this great phenomenon. It'll be called globalization. Now, anybody who'd made that speech or some version of it in 1940 would have been certified as completely detached from reality, but we know, looking back with the famous Stern lantern of historical insight, that that is exactly what happened. So, what happened to make that reality plausible and possible and realized in this interval between 1940 and 1945? Well, again, the answer is World War II. So, how did this happen? My students at Stanford, when I can get them to speak candidly about their attitude about studying history, have more than once told me, you know, Professor Kennedy, the problem with the study of history is just one damn thing after another. And if you take nothing else away from this discussion this morning, I hope it will be the thought that in this case, of the result that we got in 1945 that placed the United States at the summit of the world, it is not a story of just one damn thing after another. It's a story of some very deliberately taken decisions, grand strategic decisions that gave us the result that we got. All right, so we're coming now narratively down to the point when the United States enters the war in 1941. So let me take you back to that moment now and share with you some observations made by some major historical players in that crucible moment just after the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. So the first of these remarks comes from Adolf Hitler, who, when he heard the news of the Pearl Harbor attack, and he heard it the way virtually everybody in the world heard it over the news service wires, he said, "Now it is impossible for us to lose the war because we now have an ally who has never been vanquished in 3,000 years. That would be Japan." Now, what we're permitted to believe is, for all practical purposes, the exact same moment in time. Can't be different by more than a few minutes or possibly an hour or so. Winston Churchill gets the same news in the same way. Believe me, he had no prior knowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack. And we don't know what he said, but we do know what he wrote in one of the volumes of his great history or biography, whatever you call it, memoir of World War II, in the volume called The Grand Alliance. He tries to make the reader understand what was his state of mind when he heard the Pearl Harbor news. And this is what he wrote. I won't give you the whole thing, it would take us all morning, but this is the passage that is of most interest to us. He said, "So the United States was in the war, up to the neck and into the death. So we had won after all. England would live. I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful." Now, again, this is a reminder, to me at least, that here we have two principal actors in this great drama, Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill, hearing the same piece of pretty important news about the Pearl Harbor attack at the same moment and making 180-degree different appraisals of what will be the strategic implications of this American entry into the war. Hitler thinks it will save the German or Nazi cause, and Churchill thinks it will save England. Of course, we know who was right. But the point that I want to emphasize is that as of as late as December 1941, it was at least conceivable, if you were a serious strategic thinker, you have to give Hitler at least that much credit, to make draw a different conclusion. Because it was not known widely exactly what kind of war the United States was going to fight, where it would place its principal military emphasis, the European or Pacific theater, and on what timetable it would be able to muster a sufficient force to make a difference. Two other remarks that help us understand this framework. In mid-December 1941, a week or 10 days or so after the Pearl Harbor attack, the German foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, prepared a long memorandum for the Führer, Hitler, in which he tried to offer his strategic assessment of what it meant now that the United States was in the war. And Ribbentrop said the following. He said, "We have just 1 year to cut Russia off from her military supplies. If we don't succeed, and the munitions potential of the Americans joins up with the manpower potential of the Russians, the war will enter a phase in which we shall only be able to win it with difficulty." Now that turns out to be a much shrewder assessment of the implications of American belligerency than Hitler had blurted out the morning or the day that he heard of the Pearl Harbor attack. One last remark, and here I'm going to break the time frame of December 1941 for what I hope you'll agree is a legitimate reason, because the last remark I want to share with you came from the pen of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Imperial Navy. This is from a document he wrote in September of 1940, some 15 months or so before the Pearl Harbor attack, in a memorandum to his Prime Minister, Fumimaro Konoye, the last civilian Prime Minister of Japan before the Tojo government came to power. And this is what Yamamoto told his Prime Minister in September of 1940. He said, "If I am told to fight," Japanese-American relations were going seriously sour at this moment. So Yamamoto said, "If I am told to fight, regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for a second or third year. I hope, therefore, Mr. Prime Minister, that you will endeavor to avoid a Japanese-American war." Again, an extraordinary document coming from the pen of the person who eventually is tasked with starting the war at Pearl Harbor and also was the senior strategist in the attack on Midway 6 months later. Yamamoto and Ribbentrop knew something. They knew the first principle of warfare as laid down by the famous Chinese theorist Sun Tzu thousands of years ago. First principle of warfare, Sun Tzu said, was know your enemy. And Ribbentrop and Yamamoto knew something deep about the United States, that if it had time to fully mobilize down to its depths this gigantic behemoth industrial economy that it possessed, that it would crush any adversary or combination of adversaries then imaginable. So, in the few minutes that remain to me, I'm going to tell you a little parable that to which I'm going to give a title. I'm going to call it A Tale of Three Cities. And if we understand what happened in these three cities, we'll understand the contours of this American grand strategy. So the three cities they're all on rivers, as it happens. The first is Rouen, France, on the Seine River. The second is familiar to us all, on the Potomac, Washington, D.C. And the third is a city that actually had its name changed several times over the course of the 20th century. It began the 20th century known as Tsaritsyn. We know it today, it's named for the river on which it sits, Volgograd. But at the time our story unfolds, it was known as Stalingrad. And this is a story that unfolds in a specific frame of time, a 6-month period from August of 1942 to February of 1943. And in these three cities, in that 6-month period, things happen that if we understand their basic nature, we'll have a pretty good grip on American grand strategy in this war. So, Chapter 1, Rouen, France, August 17th, 1942. Not one of these dates that's etched into our memory like December 7th or November 22nd or 9/11, but an important date nonetheless, because on that date, a squadron of exactly 12 B-17 bombers in the United States Army Air Corps took off from their base in the south of England, flew across the English Channel, and dropped their bomb load on a railroad marshalling yard or switching yard in the city of Rouen, France. Why is this important? Well, it was the first all-American air raid on Nazi-occupied Europe. Americans had flown a little bit with the British before this date, but this was the first 100% American raid from the air on Nazi-occupied Europe in August of 1942. Very successful raid, no damage to aircraft or crew, all the ordnance dropped on the primary target. By all the usual measurements, it was a very successful expedition. That's not exactly why it's important. It's important because it marked the beginning, let me put it this way, it marked the implementation of a decision made about a decade earlier in the early 1930s that in the event of a future war, God forbid, but in the event of a future war, the United States would place its principal bet on creating and using a new weapons system and a whole new form of warfare called strategic bombing. And strategic bombing was a doctrine that had been developed by an Italian theorist named WWII after World War I. And the idea was that there was a new technology available, the aircraft, that promised to work a revolution in the nature of warfare, whereby you could deliver your blow not against the enemy's troops in the field or at sea, but instead against his civilian heartland. And you could thereby accomplish two objectives. You could so disrupt the enemy's economy and infrastructure that he could no longer sustain his force in the field. And you would also, very explicit part of Dewey's original thinking, you would so terrorize, word he used, the enemy's civilian population that they would sue their government for peace and the war would be over in a hurry. So the United States decided in the early 1930s to make this bet, that in the case of a future war, this would be a way of waging war that would leverage America's scientific and engineering and industrial advantages, and we could create a massive strategic air arm that would spare American lives and held the promise of ending the war quickly by striking at the heart of the enemy's economy and civilian society. As it happens in a wonderfully delicious turn of the wheel of history, that's something I didn't know when I was writing about this, but learned later. The pilot of the lead aircraft on that August 17th, 1942 raid was a man by the name of Paul Tibbets, who you will recognize was the pilot of the Enola Gay that dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima just about exactly, almost to the day, 3 years later. So one way to remember the significance of this matter is to think of Paul Tibbets, who opens the air war against Germany in 1942, closes the war against Japan, essentially, with the first atomic bomb in August of 1945. So in this one man's World War II military career, we have the arc of this very, very important matter that the United States, unlike virtually all other combatants, created the great constellation of its armed forces around this central element of a heavy strategic bombing arm. Now note the dates, 1942, D-Day is almost 2 full years into the future. The great dramatic Battle of D-Day and its aftermath comes 11 months before the end of the war. The principal front by which the United States carried the battle to its German adversary in the European theater was only in the last phase of the war on the ground. For 3 years, it was from the air, beginning in 1942. Okay, Chapter 2, Washington, D.C., October 5th, 1942, just a few months, weeks even, after the Rouen raid. A meeting in the office of a wartime bureaucrat by the name of Donald Nelson. He'd been the CEO of Sears Roebuck before the war. He was now the head of something called the War Production Board. His job was to shift the American economy from a peacetime to a military basis, or a wartime basis, and to mobilize the country's resources to wage the war. And he was working on the basis of a great blueprint that had been drawn up in 1941 called the Victory Program, capital V, capital P. And with the advice of a group of pretty high-octane economists, Donald Nelson had reached the conclusion by October of 1942 that he could not meet the goals of the Victory Program, either in terms of scale or timing, without hugely, deeply disrupting the civilian economy to a degree that he simply wasn't ready to do. So he argued for slowing down and scaling back the mobilization effort so as to preserve the vitality of the civilian economy, not least of all. There was a showdown meeting between Nelson and the military chiefs in his office on this date. The White House was represented by Vice President Henry Wallace, and the decision was taken to, two very important decisions were taken. One was to delay the event that we know as D-Day, the cross-channel amphibious invasion of Northwest Europe, by just about a year. The original target date for what we know as D-Day had been July 1st, 1943. As we all know, it happened June 6, 1944. And the second decision was to scale back the size of the armed force to be mobilized from the original conception of 215 divisions to just 90 divisions, leaving 115 or 125 divisions worth of manpower to work at home on the production lines and not to be put into uniform and armed and sent into battle. Now, the military called the second of those decisions the 90 division gamble. Now, why do they think it was a gamble? Well, not least because the 215 division plan had been based on the premise that the Soviet Union would collapse militarily or politically, seek an exit from the war, but would no longer be an effective fighting force as of some relatively soon-to-arrive date. Which takes us now to our third chapter, Stalingrad, February 1943, great surrender of the German army to the Red Army, to the Soviet forces, and the beginning of the great pivot of the war when the Soviet Union turns from fighting defensive war to offensive war, begins pushing the Germans back through Belarus, Ukraine, Poland, Prussia, East Germany, back into the streets of Berlin by the spring of 1945. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad, if there's any one battle that could be said to be the pivotal battle of World War II, I would say it's Stalingrad. Because that victory gave reasonably good assurance to Churchill and Roosevelt, Western planners, that the Soviets were not going to go down to military defeat and probably were not going to seek a political exit from the war. That it was a reasonable assumption now that they were going to stay and be an effective fighting force to the conclusion of hostilities. So that Soviet victory at Stalingrad, in a sense, underwrote the viability of these earlier decisions to fight principally from the air, to delay D-Day by a year, and to scale back the projected force from 215 to 90 divisions. So if we ask the question, who won World War II? Seems like a pretty straightforward question. I ask my students this, and it always provokes a pretty good discussion. You can try it on yours. One pretty good first order answer is, well, the United States won World War II. Then you might ask, well, what does it mean, who won World War II? If we mean who paid the greatest price in blood and treasure and disruption to its society to achieve the ultimate victory, it's not the United States. It is far and away the Soviet Union. But if by who won the war do we mean, if the question means who reaped the most advantage from the conclusion of the war, who was the principal beneficiary of the victory, then the answer is clearly the United States. So let me just conclude with just one last kind of grisly note. I'm going to read you some numbers here about deaths in World War II, which makes this point in a slightly different way. These are hard to hear, these numbers, but they make an important point. And I should say, by way of backdrop, is that we believe that World War II is the first war, certainly the first modern war, in which civilian casualties outnumbered military casualties. So let's keep that in mind for a moment. So let's just go through by principal country. The United Kingdom, our great ally in the war, 350,000 dead, of whom about 100,000 were civilians. China, a country we sometimes forget was a major combatant in the war, 10 million dead, of whom 6 million were civilians. Poland, 8 million dead, of whom 6 million were civilians, and the great majority of that 6 million, of course, Jews. Japan, one of our two principal adversaries, 3 million dead, 1 million of them civilians. Most of those Japanese civilians killed not in the two atomic attacks, but in the firebombing raids that began in late 1944. Germany, 6.5 million dead, 1 million of those civilians. Soviet Union, 24 million dead, of whom 16 million were civilians. And the United States, 405,399 military dead, not a trivial number. I don't mean to make small of it at all. But you put it in the scales with these other numbers, and you begin to see the picture. And on the civilian side, in a war that globally took claimed more civilian deaths than military, civilians killed whose deaths are attributable to enemy action in the 48 states that then had a star on the flag, the 48 continental United States, or lower 48 states, sometimes they're called today. The civilian death toll attributable to enemy action is exactly 6 people. And oddly enough, they died together in the most improbable place of a forested mountainside on a place called Gerhardt Mountain, Oregon. It's near Klamath Falls, Oregon, if that means anything to you. It's a very, very remote place, a highly improbable place for any military deaths to have occurred. The dead were a 26-year-old woman by the name of Elsie Mitchell and 5 school children who were with her. They were on a Sunday school picnic outing. Elsie Mitchell's husband, Reverend Mitchell, had just dropped his wife and the children off while he parked the vehicle that he'd driven them there in. And he heard an explosion, and as he ran to the sound, and he found, as he later described it, his wife and the 5 children laid out like the spokes of a bicycle wheel around something that had exploded in the center of the mall and killed them all on the spot. What Elsie Mitchell and those children had found was a Japanese firebomb. It's a little-known episode of the war, but the Japanese launched about 10,000 of these things from a place called 99 League Beach outside Tokyo. They were an absolutely primitive device. They consisted of a balloon made out of mulberry paper, the panels pasted together with potato paste flour, inflated with helium until the helium supply ran out, and that was the end of this. And underneath these balloons, about 30-foot diameter when they were inflated, there was a little gondola with a firebomb, about a 3-pound firebomb. Some of the balloons also contained an anti-personnel weapon. And the idea was that the Japanese meteorologists had discovered the jet stream before anybody else knew it existed. So the idea was to loft these things into the jet stream, which flows west to east over the northern Pacific. They would float across the Pacific and drop into the western United States and ignite forest fires on such a scale that the Americans would be forced to redirect their effort from fighting the Pacific War to extinguishing these forest fires. Now, in its own pathetic way, and it is pathetic when you think about it, this was Japan's effort to wage a strategic bombing campaign against the United States, to deliver the blow not against those Marines at Okinawa or on Iwo Jima or whatever, but at the American heartland by virtue of these balloons. So let me just try to conjure for you a scene. I'm taking a little poetic license here because I can't prove in the documents that this happened, but it's plausible. If you can imagine that you were in one of the gun turrets or the bombardier's turret, bubble blister they were called, of a B-29 bomber on your way to conduct one of those fire raids against Japan in early 1945, and you looked out through the plexiglass and you'd seen one or more of these balloons drifting, mute, they had no internal means of propulsion, just drifting toward North America, you might have wondered, what the devil is that? And what you would have been seeing, of course, is this evidence of Japan's own strategic bombing campaign against the United States. And in that scene, it seems to me, is the distillation, if you can imagine it, of what Yamamoto had said in 1940. That if the United States is provoked to war, and if it has sufficient time to mobilize all of its material, economic, financial, technological, scientific resources, it will bring to bear weapon systems that will just absolutely crush us. And if you can imagine those B-29 bombers, 4-engine bombers, droning toward Japanese cities. We leveled 67 Japanese cities in the firebomb raids, night after night, and going the other direction is this primitive Japanese firebomb balloon, no internal propulsion, drifting mutely toward North America in a highly ineffective firebombing campaign against the United States. That sums up, it seems to me, the essence of the United States' advantages in World War II, advantages that it utilized and exploited very, very shrewdly, and that produced what economists would call, to borrow some of their language, the least cost pathway to victory. That the United States actually, for all the heroism and valor that we in our forces displayed, we in essence reaped the benefits of victory by making some of the lesser amounts of material and human contribution to the victory. So I started with Churchill and that famous remark about the United States stand at the summit of the world. Let me conclude by giving you the next 2 sentences in that speech from August 1945. The United States stand at this moment at the summit of the world, he said, and then he went on to say, I rejoice that it should be so. Let her use her vast power, not just for herself, but for the well-being of all peoples in all lands, and a new era will open in the history of mankind. Whether or not that happened is another subject for another day, but that's how Churchill hoped the future would unfold. Thanks.